Picture this: a king so paranoid about his legacy that he ordered artists to lie with their paintbrushes. Yeah, you heard that right. We're talking about a guy who literally had the power to rewrite reality, one portrait at a time. But here's the thing, those paintings. They've been hiding secrets for almost 500 years. Secrets about beauty, about power, and about 6 women who walked into a gilded trap called marriage. Tonight, we're cracking open the vault on one of history's most twisted love stories, except there wasn't much love involved. Just ambition, desperation, and a whole lot of really bad decisions. Stick around because what we found about these faces is gonna blow your mind. And trust me, by the end, you'll never look at a history book the same way again. So smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let's dive into the rabbit hole. You know what's wild? We've been lied to about what these people actually looked like. Not by accident either. This was deliberate. Propaganda before propaganda was even a word. See, back in the Tudor era, your portrait wasn't just a picture. It was a statement. It was power made visible. It was how you controlled the narrative when you couldn't exactly hop on Instagram and post a selfie. And the first victim of this royal makeover, this careful orchestration of public image, was actually the one woman who probably deserved better than all of them combined. I'm talking about Catherine of Aragon. Now, Hollywood wants you to think she was this exotic Spanish princess with mysterious dark eyes and that whole Mediterranean vibe going on. You've seen the movies, right? Dark hair cascading down, smoldering gaze, that passionate Spanish fire everyone loves to romanticize. Wrong. Dead wrong. Catherine was a redhead, straight-up ginger with pale skin that probably burned if she even thought about stepping into the sun. We're talking about a woman with bright blue eyes and a face that screamed Tudor royalty, not Spanish court. She was basically the poster child for what England thought beauty should be, which makes sense because she spent most of her life trying to fit into their world, not the other way around. Think about that for a second. She left everything she knew, traveled to a foreign country as a teenager, married a prince who died on her, then married his brother and spent decades trying to prove she belonged. And through all of that, she had to maintain this image of the perfect English queen, even though she was Spanish to her core. But here's where it gets really messy, and I mean truly complicated. We've got all these paintings floating around museums and private collections claiming to be her, and honestly, most of them are complete garbage. There's this one portrait everyone calls Portrait of a Girl that might actually be young Catherine, and it looks a lot like her sister Juana, whose face we actually know for sure because we've got confirmed portraits. That gives us some hope. But then you've got a dozen other paintings of some random teenager that people swear up and down is Catherine, and they look nothing like each other. I mean, come on. We're supposed to believe all these wildly different faces belong to the same person. There's even this famous one hanging in a prestigious collection that's probably not Catherine at all. Current thinking is it might be Mary Rose Tudor, her sister-in-law, Henry's sister. Even the museum that owns it is like, yeah, we're pretty sure this is actually Mary, not Catherine. They literally changed the label. The first painting we can actually confirm without a doubt is Catherine. That's from when she was about 35 years old, right around the time things were starting to fall apart in her marriage. And it looks absolutely nothing like the earlier ones. You'd swear on a stack of history books they were painting 2 completely different people. Like, not even close. Then we've got these 2 tiny miniatures by the same artist, a guy named Hornbout, both definitely Catherine according to records and provenance, and somehow they still don't look identical. Same painter, same woman, presumably painted around the same period and yet different features. How does that even happen? Was the guy painting from memory? Did she age dramatically between sittings? Was he just having a bad day? We'll never know. So I had to get creative with the reconstruction process. I built 2 different versions, one based on what young Catherine probably looked like using the portraits we think show her in her late teens or early 20s, and another from when she was older and the crown had already chewed her up and spit her out, when she was fighting for her marriage. fighting for her daughter's legitimacy, fighting for her very identity as queen. The difference between those two versions tells you everything you need to know about what being queen actually cost these women. It wasn't just about wearing fancy dresses and waving at peasants from a balcony. It was about survival. It was about navigating a court full of people who wanted you gone. It was about producing a male heir or facing complete destruction. Catherine faced all of that with dignity for decades, and you can see it in her face in those later portraits. The weight of it all. Now, back in Tudor times, everyone was absolutely obsessed with looking pale and delicate, like you'd never seen the sun or done a day's work in your entire life. The paler you were, the more aristocratic you appeared. Tan skin meant you worked outdoors, which meant you were poor. These days, we actually want to look healthy, vital, alive. Crazy concept, right? But here's the reality check that nobody wants to hear. Only about 10% of Americans actually eat enough fruits and vegetables every day. And I'm willing to bet most of us aren't getting nearly enough quality sleep either, especially if you're watching this at 2 in the morning when you should be in bed. That's where today's sponsor Aegon comes in clutch. One scoop of this stuff packs in probiotics, superfoods, vegetables, and a whole lot more. As a new parent, and let me tell you, parenthood is absolutely wild. It's honestly a lifesaver knowing that no matter how chaotic the day gets or how many meals I end up skipping, because the baby needed something, my husband and I are covered with over 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food ingredients. Starting my morning with Aegon has become this ritual that actually makes me want to keep the healthy momentum going all day. It's like a psychological trigger. I drink it, and suddenly I'm motivated to make better choices. And at night, I use a Jeet Wo to help me wind down. It's this calming drink that gets me ready for bed, without that awful groggy melatonin feeling that makes you feel like you're wading through mud the next morning. Since it's melatonin-free, when I woke up last night to feed our daughter at 3 a.m., I was alert enough to handle it properly, but still able to fall right back asleep after. You just mix a Jeet Wo with 4 ounces of water or milk, hot, cold, room temperature, whatever you prefer. I love that it's quick, just 4 ounces, so it doesn't feel like another chore on my endless to-do list. It's more like a nice little treat before bed, something I actually look forward to. If you're ready to actually rest and recharge properly, check the link in the description or scan the QR code to get a free frother when you buy a Jeet Wo. Sleep tight, everyone. You deserve it. All right, let's talk about the woman who broke the internet before the internet even existed, before social media, before tabloids, before any of that. Anne Boleyn. This woman has caused more arguments among historians than probably any other figure in English history, and that's saying something. And it all comes down to one seemingly simple question. What did she actually look like? Because here's the fundamental problem that drives historians absolutely insane. We don't have a single painting of Anne that we know for sure was made while she was alive. Not one confirmed portrait. Everything we've got is a copy of a copy of a copy, and they all show slightly different versions of her face, like a game of telephone played with paintbrushes across centuries. The eyewitness accounts tell us she had these intense dark eyes that could apparently look right through you, a long, graceful neck that became iconic, and a wide mouth. But that's about where the agreement ends. The only image from her actual lifetime is this beaten-up medal, probably struck during her brief reign as queen, and honestly, the woman on that medal looks nothing like the Anne we see in later portraits. She's got strong features, a prominent nose, and she's wearing an English gable hood, which is interesting because most portraits show her in a French hood, the style she supposedly popularized at the English court. So which is accurate? Your guess is as good as mine. And here's a curveball that'll mess with everything you think you know. Anne might not have even been a brunette. There's actually compelling evidence suggesting she could have been a redhead, or at least had auburn tones in her hair. Yeah, I know. Mine completely blown. The dark-haired temptress image is so ingrained in popular culture that it's hard to imagine her any other way. but the evidence is there if you look for it. Check out our latest video if you want to go way deeper into that theory, because it's fascinating and it changes everything about how we visualize her. For my reconstruction, I used two really interesting sources that historians generally agree might give us the closest approximation. First, there's this photograph from the early 20th century of what people think is the lost Lumley portrait, possibly the only painted image made while Anne was actually queen, during those brief 3 years before everything fell apart. Second, there's a sketch connected to Hans Holbein, the court painter extraordinaire, that some experts think was a preparatory drawing for a formal portrait that may or may not have ever been completed. Putting those together, comparing the features, looking at what lines up and what doesn't, we can start to see what Anne Boleyn might have really looked like. And spoiler alert, she probably wasn't the seductress femme fatale that movies and TV shows love to portray. She was likely more interesting than that, more complex, more human. Moving on to wife number 3, and this is where things get really interesting from a psychological standpoint, because Jane Seymour was basically the anti-Anne in every single possible way. Nobody at court could figure out why Henry picked her. Seriously, the ambassadors were writing home like, "We have no idea what he sees in this woman." By Tudor standards, standards that were pretty harsh to begin with, Jane was plain. Like seriously plain. Not ugly, just thoroughly unremarkable. She was 27 when they got married, which back then was basically considered old for a bride, especially a royal one. Most princesses were married off as teenagers. She had very pale skin, even by Tudor standards where everyone was trying to look pale, dark blue or gray eyes that didn't particularly stand out. And she was average height. Nothing about her screamed future Queen of England. One ambassador, a guy named Chappies who wrote about everything happening at court, straight up called her no great beauty. He wasn't trying to be mean, that was just his honest assessment. Another guy, Sir John Russell, said she needed all the help she could get. Fine clothes, expensive jewelry, the whole 9 yards, just to look halfway decent standing next to other court ladies. Compare that to Anne Boleyn, who could walk into a room wearing basically anything and still command everyone's attention just by existing. Anne had charisma, presence, that indefinable quality that made people unable to look away. Jane had none of that. But here's the thing, and this is what's so fascinating about the psychology of it all. That quiet, modest, plain Jane image actually worked massively in her favor. After all the drama and chaos and quite literal bloodshed of the Anne Boleyn years, after the spectacle and the scandal and the execution, Henry wanted someone boring, someone safe, someone predictable, someone who wouldn't cause problems or challenge him or make him feel anything too intensely. And Jane played that role absolutely perfectly. She was the human equivalent of comfort food after years of spicy, unpredictable cuisine. She represented stability, traditionalism, a return to the way things used to be before Anne turned everything upside down. When it comes to portraits of Jane, we've really only got one solid option, but luckily it's a good one. Hans Holbein, the most talented painter at the Tudor court, painted her in incredible detail, showing off her expensive wardrobe and her love of embroidery. You can see her sleeves decorated in this blackwork style, this intricate black thread embroidery on white fabric that Catherine of Aragon had originally made popular in England. It's almost like Jane was consciously channeling the first wife, the good wife, the acceptable wife in her fashion choices. One thing Jane absolutely refused to budge on, would not compromise about no matter what anyone said, was the gable hood. It's honestly not the most flattering headpiece in the world. It's kind of severe and boxy and doesn't do much for most face shapes, but she wore it exclusively, stubbornly, defiantly even. Why? Because it was a giant middle finger to Anne Boleyn, who loved the trendy French hood. Everything about Jane's image, from her clothes to her hairstyle to her jewelry to the way she carried herself, screamed one message loud and clear. I am not that woman, I am nothing like her, I am the opposite of her. And for a while, it worked brilliantly. She gave Henry his son, the male heir he'd been desperately craving for decades, and then she died 12 days later from complications. And honestly, dark as this sounds, that might have been the smartest thing she could have done because she got out before he could get sick of her. She died a beloved queen, mourned and honored. She never had to face his displeasure. Now let's talk about Anne of Cleves. And we seriously need to address the elephant in the room, the reputation that has followed this woman through history for nearly 500 years. History remembers her as the ugly wife, the one Henry rejected because she was too hideous to look at, too repulsive to touch. That's the story we've all been told. But that's not even close to the full story, and it's deeply unfair to her. After Jane Seymour died in childbirth, giving Henry his precious son but paying for it with her life, Henry's advisors were pushing him hard to remarry. He needed alliances. England was isolated in Europe, facing potential threats from multiple directions. Politically, Anne of Cleves made perfect sense on paper. She was Protestant, which mattered enormously during the Reformation. She came from a powerful German family with useful connections. And honestly, with Henry's reputation spreading across Europe, with everyone knowing what happened to Anne Boleyn and the chaos surrounding Catherine of Aragon's divorce, he was lucky. Any foreign princess of decent rank would agree to marry him at all. He wasn't exactly the most eligible bachelor anymore. The first mention of Anne from an English source comes from Ambassador John Hutton, who was scoping out potential brides, and he basically said in his report, "Yeah, nobody's really talking about how pretty she is. That's not what people mention when they describe her, but whatever, she's got good connections." They sent Hans Holbein, the master portraitist, to paint her anyway. He showed her in this stiff, formal German court dress, facing directly forward in a very rigid pose, and some art historians think he might have been a little generous with her features, maybe downplaying her large nose and smoothing over some smallpox scars that she reportedly had. Henry saw the painting and immediately got excited about the marriage. He was like a kid on Christmas morning, talking about how much he looked forward to meeting her. So what else did he know about her before she arrived? Reports said she was tall, which was true, slim, which was also accurate, and had a brown complexion, which in Tudor speak just meant she wasn't as extremely pale as Jane Seymour, not that she was actually brown-skinned. Her exact hair color is unclear from the sources, but it was probably blonde or light brown, somewhere in that range. Personality-wise, the early reports were actually glowing. She was described as kind, gentle, curious about everything, eager to learn English customs and language. She seemed like she'd be a perfect, agreeable wife. But then they met in person, and it was an absolute unmitigated disaster. Henry, in his infinite wisdom and stunning lack of social skills, decided to surprise her while she was watching a bull baiting event. He dressed up in disguise, burst into her chambers, tried to kiss her, and she recoiled because she had no idea who this random old fat guy was. Henry was deeply offended that she didn't recognize him immediately, as if she should have somehow magically known. After that awkward first encounter, he complained bitterly to anyone who would listen that she wasn't as pretty as he'd been promised, that she smelled bad, that she was nothing like her portrait. He flat out said, "I like her not." Just completely rejected her based on essentially nothing. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle of all these competing accounts. Foreign ambassadors, people not trying to please Henry, describe her as tall and dignified with intelligence and grace. But she didn't fit English beauty standards, which were very specific and not very forgiving. And more importantly, she didn't fit Henry's completely delusional expectations. By this point in his life, the king was significantly overweight, in terrible health with his leg wound constantly oozing, and very possibly impotent. He was looking for someone to make him feel young again, virile, powerful, desirable. And that was never going to be Anne, no matter what she looked like. She couldn't perform that miracle. Her German style was seen as frumpy and outdated by English courtiers who considered themselves the height of fashion. But here's the kicker. Once they dressed her in proper English fashion with English styling, people said she looked so good that every creature rejoiced to behold her. Suddenly, she was attractive. So was she ugly? Not even remotely close. She was probably perfectly average, maybe even pretty by normal human standards. She just wasn't the fantasy Henry had built up in his head, and she had the misfortune of meeting him when he was at his absolute worst, physically and mentally. I created reconstructions from 2 images, one by Barthel Brine showing her in a 3/4 view with more dimension, and the famous Hans Holbein portrait that started this whole mess. Catherine Howard was wife number 5, and this is where the story gets really dark really fast, where we transition from political maneuvering to genuine tragedy. In the autumn of the year she arrived at court, Catherine traveled from her modest country home to the glamorous Tudor palace, probably excited, probably nervous, definitely unprepared for what was about to happen to her. She immediately caught Henry's eye, and I mean immediately. One source said the King's Highness cast a fantasy to her the first time he saw her. He was instantly obsessed, but what exactly did he see when he looked at her? We don't have a single verified portrait of Catherine left today. Not one that we can point to and say with certainty, that's her. Maybe one was never made during her brief time as queen. Or maybe, and this seems more likely given what happened, they were all deliberately destroyed after her downfall, after her execution, as part of erasing her from history. The descriptions we have of her appearance are frustratingly vague and unhelpful. She was short, slender, fresh-faced, and lovely. That's literally it. That's all contemporary sources tell us. No details about her hair color, her eye color, the shape of her face, nothing useful. Over the years, art historians and Tudor enthusiasts have floated a few possibilities for portraits that might maybe possibly be Catherine. There's this Holbein portrait that was identified as Catherine decades ago, but most modern experts think it's actually one of Thomas Cromwell's daughters. The date doesn't quite line up right, and the age of the girl in the painting doesn't match what Catherine's age would have been. There's also this miniature image where the subject is wearing a gold necklace that definitely belonged to the royal jewelry collection, which is intriguing. But that's not solid proof of anything. Some people think that miniature is actually Anne of Cleves, which would be ironic. Then there's this striking portrait hanging in the Metropolitan Museum in New York from the right time period, showing a young woman dressed in the style and with the status markers of a Tudor queen. Other possible identities for the sitter have been systematically ruled out over the years, so this is probably our best bet. This could definitely be the face that captivated Henry when he was in his 50s, and she was maybe 17. And honestly, looking at it, you can see why an old man would be captivated. She looks impossibly young, vibrant, alive, full of possibility. Everything Henry wasn't anymore. She represented youth and vitality and a second chance at feeling young, and he destroyed her for it. Let's talk about Catherine Parr, the one who survived, the one who managed to outlive Henry and actually got to have a life after being his wife. But somehow, despite that remarkable achievement, she's also the queen everyone forgets about. Only a handful of portraits of Catherine exist today, and almost all of them were misidentified at some point in their history, labeled as other people before scholars figured out the truth. Honestly, it kind of fits her reputation as Henry's most overlooked queen, the sensible one, the boring one, the one who didn't cause drama. So how did historians actually figure out which portraits were really her when there's so much confusion? Not by carefully analyzing her facial features, but by her jewelry. Specifically, this distinctive crown-shaped jewel she wore prominently on her chest in portraits that matches detailed records from her wardrobe accounts. That's what cracked the case. The 2 portraits we can confidently say are Catherine, without doubt or debate, were both painted from life. One when she was queen during Henry's final years, and another after Henry's death when she was finally free, both probably by an artist known simply as Master John. From these images, we can see that Catherine was genuinely beautiful by any standard. She had fair skin, dark blonde or reddish hair depending on the lighting and the portrait, and these sharp, intelligent gray eyes that seemed to look right through you. She was tall for the period, slender, and always dressed impeccably. She understood the power of presentation. She was also known to be smart, genuinely educated and intellectual, funny with a sharp wit, and full of life and energy. She was everything a Renaissance queen should be. Personally, I absolutely love the portrait made after Henry died. There's something so striking about her cat-like eyes and that calm confidence in her expression. She looks like someone who survived hell and came out stronger. It feels more real, more authentic than most Tudor portraits, which tend to be stiff and formal. So that's the image I used as the primary reference for this recreation. And now, finally, the man himself. King Henry VIII, the center around which all of this chaos revolved. His reputation is absolutely massive in history, and so are his portraits. He dominated every room he entered, both literally and figuratively. I've brought Henry to life in both young and older versions so we can see the dramatic transformation, because understanding what happened to Henry physically helps explain what happened to him mentally and emotionally. In his teens and 20s, Henry was universally described as having bright auburn hair, a golden red beard, piercing blue eyes, and calves that actually got legitimate compliments in diplomatic reports. Yeah, people were really out here writing official government documents complimenting this guy's legs. It was a thing. One ambassador called him the most handsome sovereign in the world. Another said his face was so pretty, so delicate and fine-featured that it could have belonged to a woman. High praise in that era. In his youth, he was charming, energetic, obsessed with sports and physical activity. Hunting, jousting, tennis, he did it all. His court was full of music, dancing, elaborate pageants and celebrations. His fashion was always completely over the top. Imported Italian silks, expensive furs, gold thread woven into everything. One ambassador wrote home saying he was the best-dressed sovereign in the world, that his clothes were worth more than some countries' annual budgets. During the middle of his reign, we get the most lifelike, realistic portraits of Henry, showing his small blue eyes, his long, slightly hooked nose, his small mouth, and increasingly round face. This portrait by Jules Van Cleef of Henry around age 40 is one of my absolute favorites because it captures something real about him. Then there's this one, confirmed to be painted directly by the hand of Hans Holbein himself when Henry was in his early 40s. This is our last genuine glimpse of England's beloved Renaissance prince before everything changed. Around the time this portrait was made, Henry suffered catastrophic injuries in a jousting accident. His horse fell on him. The king was left unconscious for multiple hours, and many people at court genuinely feared he wouldn't survive. When he finally woke up, he was a changed man, and not in a good way. His personality shifted dramatically. His leg wound from the accident ulcerated and would never fully heal for the rest of his life, causing him constant pain. By his 50s, he was pushing 400 pounds, massively obese and balding rapidly, carefully hiding his head under hats in every single portrait. After this accident, we have no more portraits painted from life. Just copies of lost originals, churned out by workshops and distributed as propaganda, reminders to the people of England of their once great king. Now, just for fun, let's see how I imagined all the wives and Henry if they lived in the modern day, if they walked among us now. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing to help support our channel. We'll see you next time.